In the previous episode of this long-form review, I discussed a key element to the world of colonial America, that being racial relations, and how this film's portrayal of issues surrounding race were utilized to push, among other things, a very particular view of its characters. Specifically, it used matters of racism and slavery, and their rejection by the film, to portray the protagonists as morally righteous in the eyes of a 21st century audience. In Benjamin Martin's case, for reasons already stated in the previous video, the filmmakers seemed very keen to promote him as a moral paragon and a representative of 21st century values against a backdrop of 18th century racialist thought. And race was hardly the only way in which the filmmakers promoted this narrative of Martin as a moral paragon. However, to describe Gibson's character in only those terms would be incorrect. Throughout the film, Martin is portrayed in a very interesting way. He is at times, yes, that perfect moral paragon, but more often he's shown as a man struggling with his past demons who's just trying to protect his family from war. Or, at least, that's how the filmmakers usually tried to portray him. Whether or not they actually succeeded, well, that's a different matter entirely, and determining such is precisely the point of this video. Is he a good man or a bad man? Is he a well-written character or something in between, or is he just a silly caricature? Let's talk about Benjamin Martin. But of course, before we come to that, honorable mention must be made of this video's sponsor. It's actually another YouTube channel, the curiously named, though enjoyable and quite informative, Boney Wright. It's an animated educational channel, you see, which provides an eclectic variety of content. Everything from topics of psychology and health to banking and economics. And of course, they usually have a good amount of history thrown into those subjects as well. Their most recent video was rather thematic to the times, being a discussion of the currently expanding, unfortunately so, economic crisis. I'll include a link to that most recent video in the description down below, and then from there you can find their other content as well. Personally, I would recommend their video titled The 4 Types of Human Temperament. It's a discussion of the medical humoral theory, which once dominated medical thought and practice for a pretty solid chunk of human history, although most notably, I dare say, during the 18th century. And of course, that does include the American War of Independence. Please do help to support the sponsors that support myself, simply in this case by taking a look at their channel to see what might interest you there. And thank you, Boney Wright, for sponsoring this video. Now, back to something significantly less enjoyable, The Patriot. Now, to get started, it's important to mention that Martin's character was not written in an historical vacuum. He was largely based off of a real figure, that of the Swamp Fox, Brigadier General Francis Marion. However, his comparison with this historical figure is a complicated subject, and one that I would rather cover in a later, more dedicated video. For now, I want to focus on Martin within his own context, not that of the real world, but of the world which The Patriot provides us, inaccuracies and all. Now, our first introduction to the character is a fairly grim one. The film fades in with a dramatic flare, a richly engraved tomahawk and a powder horn being placed inside of a chest and shut, while Martin speaks of grievous past sins and divine retribution.
I have long feared that my sins would return to visit me, and the cost is more than I can bear.
From the very beginning, we have these semi-religious themes: sin, retribution, and an assumed pleading of forgiveness. As you expect, these themes will repeat an awful lot throughout the film. However, this does not prevent it from having a rather lighthearted opening all the same. The first time we see Martin is in this idyllic setting. He's performing a delicate artisanal task, weighing a new and finely crafted chair that he's just made. His sons inform him that the mail has arrived, to which Martin, wisely cutting through their childish excitement, asks after a far more practical consideration.
Father, a post rider!
Did you finish planting the south field?
More than half.
Well, those swimming breaks really cut into the day, don't they?
Have the boys finished their chores? Well, of course they've not. They've wasted the hours swimming. Thankfully, of course, Martin is a calm and a collected man. He calls them out in a sarcastic but a loving way. He was a kid once too, after all, and he understands why they would disobey their orders from their father, shirking their labor, leaving half a field unplanted while they lazed about in a river someplace. And let's just be thankful that Martin is such a calm man, not prone at all to fits of rage when the world doesn't match with his desire. Oh, heavens. Okay, so maybe not. It seems like Martin has more emotional issues than we thought. Looks like that's maybe the third or even fourth chair that he's violently destroyed there. Anyways, let's move on. I'm sure that sudden violent rage, even in front of his children, won't ever be a problem for the rest of the film, not where it really matters, at least. After all, Benjamin Martin is a family man, and we never see this more clearly than when he brings his family to Charleston that he might take part in a vote regarding the grim possibility of a war with the home country. There, he explains that while he supports the principles of revolution, he does not support the war itself. He reconciles these positions by claiming that they might plead with King George and negotiate. And yes, this was a common sentiment before the war actually broke out. Even in Boston, it was held that the true problem was with Parliament, not the king, and that the best possible way to avoid a war would be a direct appeal to the sovereign. As Martin rightly explains, this war would be waged
Not on the frontier or on some distant battlefield, but amongst us.
Now, to many viewers, that is a very good argument. This is a man who has seen war before, and he wants to protect his children from it. He isn't like the hotheads surrounding him, and he's not willing to send young men to die in a war that he himself will not be fighting. To a modern audience, that kind of sentiment is immensely honorable, and at once identifies Martin as a wise, humble, and humane man who's willing to stand up for what he thinks is right. But to the men surrounding him, I think it would have had a very different effect. This argument of appealing to the king, while popular over a year ago, is by this point in the film long outdated. This part of the film is set in 1776, and the war has been going on for some time. The colonists did try appealing to the king back in July of 1775 with the Olive Branch Petition, and it was shot down by the king big time. By the time that Benjamin Martin is making this speech pleading for peace and level heads, Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, the fall of Fort Ticonderoga, the British evacuation of Boston, the formation of the Continental Army, all of that has all already happened. The British have long declared the colonies to be in open rebellion. The war has been ongoing, and for some time. Colonel Burwell calls Martin out on this lack of situational awareness. And still, Martin insists that they keep on trying to avoid a war, as if it hadn't even begun yet.
We take our case before the king. We plead with him.
Yes, we've tried that.
Well, then we try again and again, if necessary, to avoid a war.
Now, you might say, as indeed a gentleman does within the context of the film,
Massachusetts and Virginia may be at war, but South Carolina is not. Hear, hear.
that this is not a war being fought in the South, it's a war being fought by the northern colonies. But the reality is that while the war may be much more, shall we say, significant in the North at this time, it is not restricted to that region. Specific to South Carolina, the setting of this film, in 1775, there were already thousands of men in locally raised militias, both loyalists and rebels, who were already fighting one another, mainly in the South Carolina back country. There were actual rebel military operations, for example, the Snow Campaign under Colonel Richard Richardson, which saw the Revolutionaries' Provincial Congress, rather than the Royal Governor, effectively taking control of the colony by force. This entire scene would have made so much more sense if they had only just said it a single year earlier, when violence was just beginning to creep up but hadn't yet taken over in the colony. But instead, what we have here is Martin making an argument to appeal to the king directly to an illegal revolutionary government that had already applied, or at least had benefited directly from the application of, violence against loyalist elements in the colony. Point being that to this legislature at this time, Martin's argument would make him look at best uninformed of the political and military reality, while at worst like something of a buffoon.
This from the same Captain Benjamin Martin, whose fury was so famous during the Wilderness Campaign?
I was intemperate in my youth.
Temperance can be a convenient disguise for fear.
And to an 18th century audience, it might also make Martin look like a coward. As Colonel Burwell says,
I was at Bunker Hill. The British advanced 3 times. And we killed over 700 of them at point-blank range, and still they took the ground. That is the measure of their resolve. If your principles dictate independence, then war is the only way.
While Martin's reply is not political, but personal, he points out that he is a widower with 7 children.
I have 7 children. My wife is dead. Now, who's to care for them if I go to war?
Burwell again points out that such a statement is largely pointless because many soldiers have families. So Martin gives his little speech about the war being fought domestically, and Burwell asks Martin about his principles, to which Martin replies,
I'm a parent. I haven't got the luxury of principles.
Now Burwell pointed out in the debate that
Wars are not fought only by childless men.
husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers are all already out there, for better or worse, fighting and dying for this cause. Martin is claiming to support that cause, but not the war itself. After his only civic argument against the war was shot down, he doesn't continue to debate in a political sense with objective logic and reason, but instead he resorts to a personal argument. He resorts to his family and his personal reasons for refusing to fight. Now, whether for better or worse, again, Martin is using his family here as a political tool, indeed whether or not he even realizes that. He is using a personal example to justify what is a colony-wide political position. It is very likely that while this scene establishes Martin as a good man to the modern audience, it establishes him as a coward to his peers. Though aside from this one quote from Gabriel,
Father, I thought you were a man of principle.
When you have a family of your own, perhaps you'll understand.
When I have a family of my own, I won't hide behind them.
this dynamic is otherwise never really mentioned in the film. These early political scenes also serve to demonstrate that the driving force of Martin's personality is not his honor, or his dignity, his reputation, or even his being a quote-unquote patriot. The driving force of his personality and his character is his love of family, and even more so, his overriding fear of losing that family. To prevent that from happening, it seems, he is willing to sacrifice everything else, including his political principles. But then, as the film carries on, this very straightforward and cleanly defined character trait starts to feel a little thinner, shall we say. When the war does come to South Carolina, or at least when it comes as the film is concerned, there's a battle fought near to the Martin homestead. Martin dramatically walks out onto his porch at the distant sounds of cannon fire, followed soon after by his children. They're curious and scared, as any child would be. So, naturally, the best thing for their father to say would be,
6-pounders. Lots of them.
When his daughter asks how far away they are, he realizes that maybe wasn't the best thing to say to his child to put their minds at ease that they won't literally die tonight, and so he insists that the cannon are far away enough.
How far away?
Oh, they're a long way off. They're most likely heading the other direction.
Martin's excellent ability to put his children's minds at ease is later reinforced by a little throwaway line at the dinner table. Or at least it's treated as a throwaway line, because despite its very dark implications, nothing about it, or the personality disorders it might represent, are ever mentioned in the remainder of the film.
They'll probably kill us men. And dear Lord knows what to you women.
Nathan.
So it's not an immediate mark against Martin himself, I admit, but I feel like it does have to mean something when his kids are smiling wryly at the thought of their sisters and caretaker being brutally raped while they themselves are killed. Is that a weird thing for a child to be thinking about? I feel like it is, regardless of the time period being portrayed, but maybe that's just me. Indeed, we'll talk about this particular son's being particularly disturbed a little bit later on, where I'll elaborate a bit more on exactly what I mean and how it might relate to Benjamin Martin. But for now, let's carry on to the aftermath of the battle, which has his children so understandably anxious. To be sure, that anxiety probably isn't helped at all when they see their older brother come stumbling in, bloodied and weak, with a saber blow to his stomach. Now remember, above all else, Benjamin Martin wants to protect his family and prevent them from the horror that is war. Martin knows the nature of war. He has fought it before, and he knows the terrible impact that witnessing such things can have on a person. So, naturally, the morning after the battle, Martin converts his entire home into a temporary field hospital, enlisting his workers to provide aid and letting his children roam freely among the mutilated and writhing bodies which are begging for their help. And we even see the daughter to the side there cleaning out a wound. I'm sure that won't scar her at all. So, great job there with the character consistency, but oh, just you wait, it gets better. Much, much better. Because, yes indeed, when you literally bring a war to your doorstep, well, you're bringing the war to your doorstep. Now, Martin had earlier heard the story that a troop of British dragoons had massacred the men of Gabriel's regiment, his wounded son. Now he looks out to see a troop of British dragoons riding up to his house. He stares blankly forward at them. Doesn't send the kids inside, doesn't warn Gabriel to hide, just kind of stares.
Fire the house and barns.
And still a blank stare.
Let it be known, if you harbor the enemy, you will lose your head.
More blank staring.
Sir, we're not slaves. We work this land. Freedmen.
Oh, then you're freed men who will have the opportunity and the privilege of fighting in the king's army, aren't you?
Having your, freed servants get kidnapped and forced to become slave soldiers? Well, this warrants a look of mild concern, but no resistance or questioning at all.
Who carried this?
I did, sir.
Your son stupidly admitting to carrying dispatches to the known killer who just kidnapped free men and is going to torch your house? Well, a look of mild concern once again, maybe a twinge of disappointment in that child.
Hang him, put his body on display.
He's a dispatch rider, and that's a marked case.
It is finally after Tavington orders that Gabriel will be hanged as a spy that Martin steps forward and actually resists showing actual emotion. He explains, and credit to him with a genuine look of desperation, that it would be against the conventions of war to hang a mere dispatch rider. You can tell finally that Martin is panicking, that he's worried, but he's realistically trying to hide that in order to not betray his personal relation to Gabriel and thus risk his argument. Though his look of mild frustration when Gabriel betrays this intent does leave something to be desired. His begging, too, is pretty much the same tone as before. You'd think that he would be maybe a little bit more panicked, as he's losing what little control of the situation he had, and as his son's life is increasingly in danger, but we don't really see that here, not necessarily at least. Now, this is when Tavington ups the ante in a rather dramatic way, pulling his pistol directly on Martin. Now, beginning here, I think that the scene gets an awful lot better. Not for the history, of course, but for the characterization.
By the rules of war.
Rules of war. Would you like a lesson, sir, in the rules of war?
Martin is not terribly fazed by that pistol. He has seen combat. He's experienced this kind of thing before, and most importantly, he doesn't care in this situation about his own life. His priority, his mind, is on his son and defending him. Now, Tavington realizes this concern and turns the pistol on Martin's family. And that is what causes Martin's composure to crack in a much more solid fashion.
No lesson is necessary.
Of course, had he just followed his own character traits earlier and had the children, not sitting on the porch during all of this, or even just, not invited all the soldiers to his house, then this wouldn't be a problem to begin with. But still, we see Martin rush over and we hear that cracking of his voice as he more genuinely pleads for his family's life. Martin is still trying to maintain composure. He's trying his best because he knows that is the only way he's going to be able to get out of this situation. But you can hear genuinely the fear, the anxiety, the anger in Gibson's voice as he is speaking those lines. Likewise, you hear the same tension when, after Tavington orders the rebel wounded killed and he begins dragging Gabriel away, another son tells his father to do something.
Father, do something!
Be quiet.
Martin knows that he is powerless here. He knows that if more ruckus is raised, his family is at risk. He hasn't given up, but he's desperately searching for a way out, any way out that will not risk his children. As he holds his family back, presumably trying again to rapidly comfort them and formulate a plan as their home is about to be burned down, well, that same son rushes forward. His impetuosity of youth, of course, demanding action well before thought. And again here we see actual acting as Martin cries out for his son and runs towards him. The boy is shot and killed. Desperation, fear, sorrow. As Gabriel is pulled away, Martin holds his son, his entire world devolving to the boy that is dying in his arms. Disbelief mixed with anger, mixed with a sadness that only a parent could know. That is what we get out of this part of the scene. I mean, honestly, if the history behind it wasn't so terrible, I would even say that it's beautiful. Just look at the face as Martin slowly loses his son, utterly lost for words. His entire life has just fallen apart. Everything has changed and is continuing to change uncontrollably around him. He looks up to see Gabriel being dragged away, his farm destroyed, his workers kidnapped, even the men whom he risked it all to try and save, murdered, rendering all of this utterly without reason. Again, it'd be just beautiful and terrible if only it weren't so insulting, but we'll get to all of that later on. For now, we're just talking about Martin within his own context. But unfortunately, I'm afraid, it's also in this most beautiful moment that things start to get a little, nonsensical, to say the least. Sorrow being replaced by fury, and with the knowledge that he needs to take dramatic action if he's going to save his other son from the same fate, he lays the body of his boy on the ground and growls to his family.
All of you stay here.
Before running back into his burning home to retrieve a rather ridiculous number of weapons from his murder chest.
Nathan, Samuel. Margaret. I want you to hide in the fields with William and Susan. If we're not back by sunset, I want you to take them to your Aunt Charlotte's. Is that clear?
And with that line, we begin to see the true unraveling of Martin's character. And now, yes, he is in duress here, so it's a little understandable, but it gets worse from here, not to worry. What Martin is doing here is leaving half of his remaining family at the burning farmstead completely alone and unarmed, which seems utterly ridiculous given everything that's just happened. Like the son said earlier,
And do Lord knows what to you women.
There is no guarantee that a lone dragoon, or a soldier catching up with the column, or another wounded man, or any other kind of soldier would perhaps see the smoke and go to see what's going on. This film has already established just how particularly brutal this enemy is. So who's to say they won't go just a little bit further on a whim? Martin is leaving his young daughters alone in a burning field with the fresh corpse of their own brother. The least that he could do is make sure that they're in a safe location. You know, he told them to hide in the field, but there's a pretty solid chance that those fields catch fire, in which case those kids suffer a much worse fate than just being shot. Or even better, how about he leaves even just one of those older boys behind with one or two of those firelocks to at least provide some semblance of protection for them. It wouldn't help against an army, and it would be doubtfully helpful against even a soldier, but still, at least it would be something. It would definitely help to protect them against any stray bodies that may come waltzing down the road, having to inspect what's going on with all that smoke, or perhaps any untrustworthy individuals that they may come across as they go over to their aunt's estate, presuming that Martin doesn't come back from rescuing Gabriel. But no, Martin brings all of the weapons with him alongside the two older boys who would be able to provide some assistance. Naturally, as a man trying to protect his family from the ravages of war, and he's done a bang-up job of that so far, he's arming his sons here and bringing them along with the express purpose of taking on what looks to be an entire company of the British Army. Now, in any realistic and unextraordinary setting, you must understand that this is a suicide mission. He is bringing these boys to, at the very least, witness the brutal death of their father as he's riddled with lead and skewered with bayonets. At the worst, he's even bringing them to the same fate, if the soldiers don't happen to feel very merciful towards the children that day. And you can see the terror in their eyes as Martin, with his own maddening glare, is telling his children how to kill men.
I want you two to start with the officers and work your way down. Can you tell the difference?
Yes, Father.
Yes, Father.
Good. What did I tell you fellas about shooting?
Aim small, miss small.
Aim small, miss small. Boys, Samuel, steady.
Before ultimately telling them what he probably should have had them do from the very outset, if he's so gung-ho on literally taking on the army, to just take the family to their aunt's house where they would be safe. The kids would still be scared, and scarred, to say the least, but nowhere near to how bad as it's about to get. So, of course, the column comes on, and I'll go into more details of how horrible this fight scene is in a future episode. Suffice to say for now that after asking his Christian God to help him kill these men who have done him wrong, I'm sure we all remember that bit from the Sermon on the Mount. It's a common theme, but more on that later. We get that most iconic scene as Benjamin Martin, an old man whose last military combat was at least over 15 years ago, allied with two small children who've never shot a man in their entire lives, manages to take on and defeat in perfect execution what looks to be 20 or more professional soldiers of the British Army from 1780, a force that was adept and renowned for its marksmanship, its skill in light infantry maneuvers, speed and zeal in the field, and expertise in close quarters bayonet fighting. Again, exactly how and why this scene is so terrible is a subject for another, more dedicated video, but suffice for now, it establishes that Benjamin Martin is effectively the perfect warrior, in stark contrast to the British, who are portrayed as weak, unprofessional, unskilled, and even cowardly. But again, thankfully, Martin is perfect enough as a warrior that the hostage situation is quickly resolved. You'd think that maybe Martin, whose inspiration for all of this is to save his son, even at the expense of losing his other children, that he wouldn't do something so insanely risky as all of this. I mean, not only could he obviously miss, but even hitting the soldier dead on like he does, there's not an inconsequential chance that Gabriel's throat is still slit by the end of it. I mean, that knife looks really close pressed to his throat. And actually, we do see that his throat was cut a little bit later on. I guess he was just really lucky enough to not have the blade go a little teensy tiny bit closer, or else Gabriel would likely be choking on his own blood. Anyways, like I said, Martin is basically a super soldier. Unfortunately, as regards his more relatable and sensible traits, he's not actually that much of a super dad, because to top off this horrific experience for his boys, having been forced to, kill people, watch a second brother very nearly be murdered in front of them, and of course seeing their father shoot surrendering men and tomahawk others in the face, they even get to see Dad chase after a fleeing soldier and not just kill him to make sure he doesn't tell anyone about what happened, but mutilate his corpse into a bloody pulp while he screams in a traumatic rage. Dad of the Year, to be sure. And here's the best part about all of this. It was entirely and wholly unnecessary. Let me make my case. Benjamin Martin is a gentleman. He is a member of the landed gentry with powerful connections to other members of the same social class, particularly his own sister-in-law, the immensely wealthy Charlotte. He is well respected by his peers, he is a literal war hero, and he owns a significant, he owned a significant estate, likely controlling a good deal of wealth. And he also knows, as is shown later on in the film, how to deal with the matters of the court, how to navigate that genteel world. He also knows the customs and articles of war as he attempts to use them to save his son from Tavington, and also later on to negotiate with General Cornwallis. In a more reasonable setting, what would have happened is that after Martin's son, who was serving as a dispatch rider, was wounded in action, and subsequently being treated for otherwise lethal wounds, was arrested to be hanged as a spy, an accusation which any court-martial would find him innocent of on lack of evidence, what Martin should have done is immediately take his family to Charlotte for protection. Then he could have made his way as a country gentleman directly to the British Army itself. He could have requested a meeting with anyone of sufficient rank, Cornwallis himself, perhaps General O'Hara, even any of the staff officers. Again, he is an important man, and I expect that when it's seen what happened to him, when he tells his story, that he could most certainly get his meeting with someone important. Subsequently, he explains to the general that his young child was shot in the back by a colonel who already had a troublesome reputation. His farm was burned to the ground after he had provided medical aid to British soldiers. That wounded men were massacred on order of the same colonel. The proof is to be found literally at the farm where corpses surround the burnt husk. And on top of all of that, his son was arrested and to be killed on trumped-up charges without evidence. What, Cornwallis wouldn't listen? We see established in the film itself that Cornwallis is angry with Tavington for not only his misconduct in battle, but also for his criminal acts. Cornwallis only comes to accept the terrorizing Tavington commits after his plans are being ruined by Martin later on in the film. There is no reason to suspect, even in this ahistorical setting, and deeply flawed setting at that, that Cornwallis would not come to Martin's side. Especially considering that it is probably known to Cornwallis that Martin even argued against the war in earlier years. He was an ally to the Loyalists effectively, if not in spirit. Having an influential gentleman and a former war hero turn against them would be terrible, especially when you're defending a literal child murderer who is difficult to deal with even before all of this started. And while there may be no evidence that Gabriel was a spy beyond the word of an officer who is already established to be untrustworthy, there is mountains of evidence against Tavington that could be heard at a general court-martial. Not only is there the physical evidence of the burned-down farmhouse and the corpses of men who had been receiving medical care, there's also the testimony of literally every soldier and officer in the force that was there, including, of course, the wounded men who were being given aid by Martin. Remember that one officer who had a look of fear and sorrow through all the war criming? Yeah, how about rather than shooting him, you could use him as an ally in the courts? To say nothing of the clearly dozens, even hundreds of neighbors and local gentry who could attest to Martin's good character. Even his freed slaves seemed to love the guy because he was just oh so morally righteous. But no. Rather than deal in reason and see Tavington face a fate far worse than death in battle, that of being cashiered and left destitute as an outcast of polite society, to die penniless and disgraced and alone.
You and I both know that I can never return to England with honor.
Instead, Martin, in his rage, takes up arms and, in every literal sense of the word, abandons half his children and leads the others directly into war. From the very beginning of this film, the most clearly defining trait of Benjamin Martin was that he is a widower who seeks above all else to defend his family. And in the course of just a few scenes, through stupidity, incompetence, and uncontrollable anger, that trait entirely collapses, or at least near entirely collapses. Everything bad that happens to Martin in this film could have been avoided incredibly easily had he only just followed his own philosophy. I should say, if only he had been written consistently. But no, at the drop of a hat, he abandons that philosophy and invites the war to his own doorstep. And that betrayal, alongside the bad writing, becomes even more obvious, I think, in Martin's next few scenes. Having brought his family to the relative safety of his sister-in-law's estate, we see him speaking with his son before bed.
I killed those men.
You did what I told you to do. You did what you had to. There was no wrong in it.
I'm glad I killed them. I'm glad.
This is the same son who earlier made that comment about his sisters being sexually assaulted by soldiers, so he already started coming off as a little creepy earlier on in the film, and now it's become apparent that with everything he's been through, he's just outright disturbed. Benjamin Martin's chief goal was always to keep the war away from his family, and now we see it has corrupted one of his children with the same trauma that he himself has been suffering with since his own war experiences. That simple line, "I'm glad I killed them," is so heavy in terms of that child's psychology, in terms of how warped he has become by the gruesome terrors which he has seen and committed, that you'd think it would represent a major plot development in this story. Yet this is the best response that Martin is able to offer.
Get some rest.
You can relate to this, Martin. You know the pain that this kind of thing leads to. Your worst fears are coming to light in front of you during this very scene, and the best you can come up with is get some rest. I'm moderately concerned. Sleep it off, son. Did that help you after the war? Getting some sleep? Did that make the PTSD go away, Martin? I don't think so. Now, yes, in this exact moment, it can be said that Martin is stunned. He just doesn't know what to say. He's terrified. Again, he's watching helplessly as all around him his world is crumbling. But here's the thing. Here's why that is not actually the case. That scene, that dynamic, the idea that this boy is broken, that he's literally glad that he killed people, is never mentioned again in the film. Martin never has a heart-to-heart with him. We never see the psychological impact of this, except maybe with one exception much later on in the film when Tevington goes to burn down Charlotte's estate. As the riders are coming up, we see that the boy had fallen asleep outside of the home, cradling a firelock in his arms. Now, if Charlotte was worried about security, it would have made much more sense for her to have an actual guard posted. She has plenty of slaves and presumably plenty of employees as well, and the ability to hire a watchman should she desire. This kid is out here of his own volition. He wasn't asked to take up this responsibility, but again, the fact that he's become so psychologically scarred by war that he is apparently no longer sleeping in his own bed lest soldiers come to kill him and his family in the night, it's never mentioned. It took me a while to actually realize, wait a second, why is the sun outside there? It's never talked about in the film. Indeed, in the context of the film, it may well just as much be the case that he just fell asleep outside and he was cleaning the gun beforehand, because there is no indicator of actual stress there. I'm just reading into the situation. So if indeed I am overinterpreting this, well then it's actually even worse than the alternative that I'm mentioning here, I think. Now, as for the other son, the younger child whom Martin brought into war, he is now afraid of his father, and you can hardly blame him. He saw his dad mutilating a corpse while screaming at it. Look here at how he glances at his father. Look how he's cradling his head in his arms. Look how he turns away. This boy may be even more broken than the last one. But again, Martin just ignores the behavior, and it is literally never mentioned again.
You've done nothing for which you should be ashamed.
"Oh, you've done an awful lot, Martin, just nothing even remotely right. But thankfully, your sister-in-law, soon-to-be romantic interest, because that's not weird at all, is there to reaffirm that you're perfect in everything you do, lest the audience begin to fathom the idea that maybe Martin isn't necessarily the best character, and that he didn't make the right decision by having his young children shoot people." And that idea is nowhere better reinforced than the next morning, when Martin, being unable to convince Gabriel to stay with them, leaves for rebel service in order to watch over his eldest on campaign. As he's saying goodbye to his family, we get almost zero sense of the trauma which they've undergone to this point. They're all just mildly upset to see Dad riding off to war.
Nathan, I want you to take care of your brothers and sisters and your Aunt Charlotte. I'm dependent on you.
Look at the faces here. There's almost no emotion to be had. The older boy has a neutral disposition, and the other is just disappointed. Kinda looks like he was just told the family trip to Disney was canceled unexpectedly. Again, those two immensely significant moments for the character development of not only the children, but Martin's own character as a father figure is never mentioned again. The dynamic never utilized in their future interactions. They're practically back to normal as if nothing happened. The kids show no sign of trauma, of suffering throughout the remainder of this film. It's actually even worse than there being a simple lack of character development. It's almost like there was an active degeneration in their character arcs. First, they're normal, happy kids. Second, they experience extreme horrors and are scarred by those terrors. But then, when the dad is abandoning them to literally ride off and fight in the same war that was responsible for it all, well, suddenly they're fixed automatically. I guess it turns out Martin was right. All it takes to fix PTSD is a good night's rest, I suppose. It's just such a missed opportunity to show what could have been a beautiful and a tragic moment of character development, particularly for Martin as a father. Now, as usual with this film, we do get one scene that shows wonderfully exactly what I mean when I use the words missed opportunity. Because if we go back a little earlier to the moment that Gabriel tells his father that he's leaving, we do see that emotion. We do see what this film could have been in a scene which I think is actually wonderfully authentic feeling, not only to the 18th century, but to the entire situation and how desperate it must seem.
Gates and the Continental Army are at Hillsborough. I'm joining up with them.
Gabriel.
No, your place is here now.
I'm going back. I'm a soldier, it's my duty.
Your duty is to your family.
We see the conflict of loyalty to one's family and to one's cause.
Don't you walk away from me, boy.
I'm sorry, Father. I'll find you when this is all over.
No, you're not going. I forbid you to go. I'm not a child. You're my child.
The internal filial struggle as Gabriel is trying to become his own man, even against the pleading of his father.
I'm losing my family.
And the tearing apart of a family by the fires of war. This is a beautiful scene. It feels so appropriate to the time period, and its emotions are so strong, so real. But, of course, even here, we are reminded again of the writer's limitations, and of the fact that Martin isn't necessarily the best person, if only you just look a little deeper into his words and actions. I don't mean his yelling at his son and demanding loyalty. That's entirely appropriate to the time period, even today in many circumstances. And he is in a desperate situation. I don't blame him for that. I'm talking about this line right here.
Thomas is dead. How many more have to die before you'll heed my word?
Oh, lovely, Martin. What an excellent way to turn the death of your son around and place the blame squarely in Gabriel's lap. When you ask him how many more have to die before you'll heed my word, what you're saying is, if you had listened to me earlier, your brother would still be alive. And if you don't listen to me now, more of your family will die. So how many does it have to be until you realize that I'm right and you're wrong? It is a horrible thing to say to anyone, let alone your child, who is suffering the exact same loss, particularly when you probably had way more to do with it than he ever did. Let alone when the very next morning you yourself ride off to war and end up causing, indirectly or not, even more innocent deaths than your son ever would. But we'll get to Martin's own war record in just a bit. Before we do, it's worth noting that at least one of Martin's children does have at least a moderately meaningful, or at least an attempt at a meaningful, reaction to all of this. That is to say, a trauma that lasts a bit longer than 24 hours. Susan, the youngest daughter, has been having difficulty speaking. Apparently, she hasn't said a word since her mother died in 1773. So in a way, actually, the trauma is predating anything in this film, but at least it means we get to see a child that isn't just A-okay with everything that's happened so far. As Martin says goodbye to her, we do see a genuine apprehension, a fear in Susan's gaze. Not disappointment, but genuine anxiety. We see in Martin's own behavior a last attempt to connect, as his goodbye sounds almost pleadingly desperate, his eyes just asking her for a single word to indicate that he hasn't failed her in some way.
Susan? Goodbye.
It's the only really sad part of this goodbye, something that indicates something is horribly wrong here. Like, you know, the mother figure being ripped away from the children's arms, the brother being shot, the farmhouse being burnt down, and the father and older brother riding off to war. Indeed, as the film progresses, Susan's trauma seems to be the only one that actually sticks around. It is later revealed, after Tavington burns down Charlotte's estate and they're taken to the Maroon settlement, that with the father gone, Susan has actually been speaking in complete and articulate sentences.
Where is Father?
Speaking for months now.
Speaking for months.
Why did he go?
And with this revelation, what is it that Susan says about her father?
He'll come and see you as soon as he can.
I don't care. I hate him.
Oh, Susan, you don't hate him.
I hate him, and I hope he never comes back.
I don't care. I hate him. I hope he never comes back. Wow. Powerful words in any circumstance, let alone from a young girl who has apparently been mute for most of her life about her own father. This could mean so many things for their relationship. Does she blame Martin for everything that's happened, associating him with the horrors and the privations she's recently experienced? Heavens knows she wouldn't be entirely wrong to do so. Or perhaps these wounds cut even deeper. After all, Susan has been mute for much longer than just the murder of her brother. Could she feel distanced from her father due to the lack of a true maternal figure in her life? Could her feelings of isolation and resentment be seated in how much this child misses her mother? Through her father's inability to connect and relate with her, to fill that emotional maternal void, does he in fact become isolated and emotionally distanced from his own daughter? I'm not a child psychologist. I can't answer these questions or even talk in much depth about them. But one thing at least is clear, that this child is suffering and that her relationship with her father is deeply damaged. Susan has experienced so many things that have utterly broken grown adults, and she is feeling emotions that she cannot possibly comprehend. What this does, in a positive sense for the film, is provide these characters, and particularly Benjamin Martin, with an extraordinary opportunity for growth. Sure, the other difficult parenting moments he ought to have had seem to have vanished into the air, but it seems like the writers actually remembered at least this one. What is he going to do? How can he possibly reconnect with his daughter? How can he, or anyone for that matter, help her to process everything that's happened? These are questions which would plague any parent, let alone a one in this grim a situation. And these questions come to a head when yet again Martin has to leave his family behind and march off to war. Kneeling at her level, Martin begs her for a word, any word.
Goodbye, Susan. Goodbye. Just one word, that's all I want.
And when Martin goes to hug her, she clutches the doll that once belonged to her late mother, and she retreats in fear of her father. So Martin, put back, stands up and goes to leave. And it is at this moment, as the father is riding away, that the miraculous happens.
Papa! Papa, don't go! Say anything!
Susan, the young daughter, through her tears, cries out for her father to come back.
I'll say anything you want. Tell me what you want me to say. I'll say anything you want me to say. I promise, Papa, please don't go.
She runs forward, again exceptionally articulate through these extreme emotional distresses, begging her father that she'll say anything, if only he'll just stay. That line hits really hard. But still, we mustn't let the emotion here get in the way of our overall analysis. Because again, what we have here is a rather shameful device being applied by the writers to shift any kind of blame off of Martin and on to other characters. Note that in this interaction, it is the young daughter who apparently has overcome all of those earlier mentioned complicated emotions. She's realized that no, she doesn't hate her father. She doesn't fear him, as she did just a few seconds ago. She isn't even so overwhelmed with sorrow that she's incapable of articulating that sorrow, as most young girls would be at the loss of an ice cream cone, let alone everything that Susan's experienced so far. But she is able instead to shout out to Martin, to run after him, and to promise him that she'll say anything he wants, if only he'll just stay. Susan, in her brief few scenes, has apparently come to terms with her trauma and reached an extraordinary level of emotional awareness. Now, she isn't necessarily fixed, like the boys seem to be, but certainly she's made extraordinary progress, enough to, again, justify that we never see or hear about any of this again. You see, this here is the end of her arc. She's now recovered from her pain and has come to the proper realization that indeed her father is a good man and has done nothing wrong. And of course, do note as well that the father has done nothing to actually aid in this progress. That is not how a father-daughter relationship ought to work. In this situation, the father is not absolute moral good. He is not without flaw. We have ample reason to believe that he, as a parental figure, leaves much to be desired. The root cause of this difficult relationship, the death of the mother, has hardly been fixed or resolved in any way. And worst of all, Martin's character has not changed in any real capacity. There has been no development. Again, the need for development here is being offloaded to not the father, but the daughter. She needs to learn the lesson. She needs to process her emotions, and she needs to be the one to reach out to her own father. Benjamin Martin has this now miraculously fixed relationship with his daughter just handed to him on a silver platter, not requiring any work on his own part to actually build it. And that's not how relationships, any relationship, parental or otherwise, work. Now, just earlier on, there was a point where the film kind of teases that maybe a little bit of emotional development will be taking place on the part of the father, as some sort of sign that maybe he'll have a revelation of sorts.
She spoke. Susan talked to you?
Full sentences. As if she'd been speaking all along.
Damn, I wasn't there for it.
But oh, no, not to worry. It's immediately replaced with more action. That's right, no room for development here. We have war crimes to get to. Oh, yes, and speaking of war crimes, I think it may be appropriate to discuss Martin's actions in combat and on campaign, because while terms like war criminal are not terribly appropriate to the 18th century, the same general concept of there being certain boundaries of conflict, mutually understood, though often informal terms of how you behave on a campaign, what you should do and should not do, certainly did exist during this time period. And throughout the film, Benjamin Martin is shown to be breaching an awful lot of them. The British are as well, of course, but that's something we'll discuss in another dedicated video later on. Right now, we're just talking about Benjamin Martin. Now, from the introduction of this film, we get the hint of some past atrocities being committed by Martin.
I have long feared that my sins would return to visit me.
Another hint comes around 20 minutes into the film, after Thomas finds his father's old coat. Horse blanket that it is, but again, we'll go over that later on, and other items from the last war. After a conversation about Thomas wanting to enlist, but being too young, he asks his father about his past.
Father, what happened at Fort Wilderness?
Put it away.
This heavy question would later be echoed by Gabriel while sitting around a fire, their relationship being on a more equal level as men who have experienced combat, and no doubt some regret at his son dying without knowing the whole truth earlier. Martin explains to Gabriel in full why so many men think of him as a hero. It turns out that Martin was partly responsible for an event which helped to end the war against the Cherokee. A little convenient, I know, but again, he's the hero, what else would you expect? It was after the French and Cherokee forces had captured a British fort and massacred the colonists taking shelter there, mutilating their bodies in the process. Martin's own troops had later met these French and Cherokee at a certain Fort Wilderness, which is a fictional event, incidentally, where, he explains, they met and exceeded that earlier brutality.
We took our time. We cut them apart, slowly, piece by piece. I could see their faces. I could still hear their screams. All but two, we let them live. We placed the heads on a pallet and sent them back with the two that lived to Fort Ambercon. The eyes, tongues, fingers, we put in baskets, sent them down the Ashalot to the Cherokee. Soon after the Cherokee broke their treaty with the French. That's how we justified it.
Brutal stuff, and certainly enough to justify Martin's apprehensive feelings towards this new war. But of course, the past is the past. Martin had a terrible past, yes, but the theme that he regrets these actions and seeks forgiveness for them is repeated throughout the film. He is meant to be penitent for his sins. So let's take a look at some of that penitence in action. In his first on-screen combat, the one where he brings his kids along for the ride, we get a few noteworthy instances. First, we see Martin tomahawk a soldier who is struggling to stand up and unarmed, unlikely to be a threat. Though he was very close and could easily have rejoined the fight after having been knocked aside by Martin, so he did pose enough of a threat to technically justify this action, at least in a way. You'd be much harder pressed, however, to apply that same argument to this man, who had just been disarmed and winded with a strong blow to his head on his knees with his hands up in surrender. Arguably in the haste of action, Martin shoots him in the head. The most damaging case against him, and the one we've already discussed earlier, comes in the clearly desperate and terrified soldier running for his life before being mutilated. On one hand, yes, Martin needed to kill this man, and the others too, lest they tell other soldiers about what happened, as indeed this did happen with a survivor left over. So it's dark, and for reasons I discussed previously, certainly a very bad mark against him, but it's not necessarily the worst as regards what we'd today term war crimes. However, we have strong reason to believe that these kinds of actions, and indeed much, much worse, continue to be a problem. Later on in the film, after Martin joins the war and is given a command, we have a montage of surprise actions against the British supply lines. Atrocious in their own special ways, but again, that's not why we're here today. At the end of this montage, we have a scene in which Martin's men execute, purposefully and methodically, a number of surrendering soldiers who at one point beg for mercy.
We surrender! We surrender! Oh! No! God! For the love of God, we...
Not only do we see the initial men shouting they surrender, but the others as well. They aren't killed in the heat of the moment, but their murderers stare them in the eyes as they finish loading their pieces or drawing their blades and kill them in a deeply personal and meditated fashion. Now, thankfully, Gabriel is there to scold his father and his men for, again, literally murdering people in front of his eyes.
These men were about to surrender!
No, Gabriel, those men had surrendered. The Frenchman pulls a classic move among war criminals, immediately refusing to acknowledge what just happened, as if lying in the short term makes lying in the long term any better or easier.
Perhaps. We will never know.
The Reverend, who for some quite literally ungodly reason has taken to political violence himself, rightly points out that
This is murder!
Well, Reverend, they're redcoats. They've earned it.
The reply, of course, being that no, these weren't people, these were the dreaded enemy, and ergo, they deserved what they got. Yeah, I guess that logic doesn't really hold up when you're on the receiving end, does it, buddy? Anyways, Gabriel explains to his father and the men that, in fact, murder is a bad thing. Some of the men resist such a controversial claim.
What do you know about war?
I know the difference between fighting for a
You guys don't back the church!
No, not
quiet!
But thankfully, Martin immediately comes to the light.
He's right. In the future, full quarter will be given to British wounded and any who surrender.
The British men of war gave no such quarter when it fired on a ship carrying my wife and daughters.
Other than the Frenchman offering a ridiculously flimsy and emotionally driven whataboutism argument, which we'll discuss how ridiculous it is in future content, his men all go along with it with zero complaint.
Every man here is free to come and go as he pleases. But while you're here, you will obey my command, or I will have you shot.
Which is rather miraculous in the end. These are men who just a few moments ago showed themselves not only more than able, but even eager to murder surrendering soldiers. But now that they were told to stop, like a switch, we never even see these sorts of activities again throughout the film. Turns out it's really easy to stop massacres and other criminal acts among ill-disciplined soldiery. All you need to do is give them a stern talking to. Just ask them to stop, and I guess they will. I'm sure that approach works out just fine. Just ask 1945 Berlin, 1937 Nanking, 1901 Beijing, 1812 Badajoz. In any case, this leads into a moment that's really quite funny in relation, because the force comes across two very large and very angry dogs guarding some baggage. Now, this is a band of men, including Martin, who were earlier more than willing to, at the drop of a hat, kill surrendering men. Yet these men are just prodding at the dogs a bit, trying to get them to move. After a moment or two, then they decide that they're going to shoot them. What's funny is that it isn't just an automatic response. These men are giving more dignity to actively hostile animals than their comrades did to helpless and pleading men. I'm not saying it's an unrealistic response, I'm saying that it helps to show just how terrible these people are, how warped their worldview is. Aha, but thankfully you see, once again, Benjamin Martin is just perfect, and he realizes that the dogs, they're not stressed and angry and afraid because a literal battle just happened around them and their old handlers being brutalized and killed all around them as strangers with knives and guns approach the wagons. No, not at all. Turns out they're just a little hungry, so Martin throws a bit of meat and the dogs run along and have a swell old time. I mean, thank goodness, right? I mean, nobody wants to see the animals get shot. That's perfectly normal. We're A-okay with watching people who are begging for their lives get mercilessly slaughtered, but watching a dog get hurt? Whoa, that'd be too much. Yeah, no, that's definitely not a sign of some mental issues at all on the part of the audience. In any case, the reason why I mention the dogs specifically is because they'll become more relevant later on. Just remember the absurdity of this interaction and how it once again represents Martin as being oh so much smarter than all those around him. And let's talk about that theme, because throughout this film, Martin is portrayed as, well, not quite perfect, I suppose, but definitely as the exemplar, not only in terms of martial prowess, but also in terms of morality and even intellect. This isn't so much shown by Martin being just that good, except maybe in terms of individual combat, but more so by showing everyone and everything around him as totally inept. We touched on this idea earlier when I described Martin's speech to the legislature in Charleston, how his argument was actually very poor, but how the overall atmosphere of the film didn't really acknowledge that, as it established its own strangely variant timeline of events. This blissful lack of awareness on Martin's behalf is most ironically displayed, of course, as regards military tactics and strategy. We first see it with this scene, nominally intended to represent the Battle of Camden. Martin walks up behind his son and offers his sage advice on how General Horatio Gates ought to have fought the battle.
That Gates is a damn fool. He spent too many years in the British Army. Going muzzle to muzzle with redcoats in open field. It's madness. This battle was over before it began.
With these lines, Martin and the film's writers accomplish a variety of things. Firstly, they establish that General Gates, and by association the entirety of the professional army, are stuck in their old ways and refuse to adapt and use more supposedly practical means of waging this war. He even takes the fact that Gates was an experienced soldier with years of professional experience, too many years in the British Army, and turns that professionalism against him, as if it were a bad thing that hurt his ability to wage war. Gates wasn't necessarily the best general, but I doubt his experience is the reason why. Then, with the comment that the battle was over before it began, Martin implies a sort of foreknowledge of what was about to occur. He could have told you this result before it even happened. He is, in this way, much smarter than Gates and his staff. He takes his lack of professional experience, his lack of qualifications, and in a conspiratorial fashion has it seem that this actually makes him more qualified than the general. This is a very common style of manipulation. You downplay and discredit the other while backhandedly promoting oneself. Gates is a fool, ergo Martin, who realizes this, must be wise. Don't trust the other, even if they purport to be professionals and experts, because despite all of their objectively superior arguments and learning and experience doing exactly this kind of thing, only Benjamin Martin has the pure insight to tell you how to really win a battle. It's emotional manipulation, plain and simple. It's also objectively wrong. Not counting how the portrayal here of linear combat is entirely historically inaccurate, again the subject of another day, this going muzzle to muzzle with redcoats is precisely how the majority of, at least major, battles in this war had been fought, both victories and defeats. If you call Gates a damned fool for forming a line of battle, you'd have to say the same thing of Washington and every other general besides. In similar fashion, both sides had been employing more irregular methods of war, light infantry, skirmishing, etc., for most of its duration. To be sure, there were a lot of mistakes going into Camden, and Gates is worthy of censure in many ways, but it's not because he went muzzle to muzzle. By oversimplifying the complexity of causes behind the battle and defeat, it allows the audience to believe that the solution is a simple matter for anyone with good sense, i.e., good old Ben Martin. It's being made out like none of the actual military leaders have any idea what they're doing. Martin, on the other hand, has that sense. He knows exactly what to do. That Martin is an unrivaled military genius surrounded by fools is immediately reinforced a few minutes later when he meets with his old friend, Colonel Burwell.
I'm in no mood for a lecture.
Where's your General Gates now?
Again, we have this rubbing in that the professionals are incapable, but Martin is there, thankfully, to save the day. On something of a whim, based off his performance in the French and Indian War, he's given a command of militia. Again, that conversation serves to establish in the viewer's mind a great deal many things.
We're a breath away from losing this war, Benjamin. In the north, Washington is reeling from Morristown. He's running and hiding from 12,000 redcoats. In the south, Cornwallis has broken our back. Captured over 5,000 of our troops when he took Charlestown.
The situation is desperate. The war can be lost at any time. Washington is reeling, running, and hiding, while Cornwallis is an unstoppable juggernaut who's broken the rebels' back. Immediately, of course, after a 2-minute sit-rep, Martin knows full well the severity of the situation, so much so that he's able to finish the sit-rep himself. It's a common, tired trope that shows just how smart our main character really is.
And he destroyed the only army between him and New York. So now there's nothing to stop him from heading north to finish off Washington.
Burwell explains how the French are sending aid and that the rebels need to hold out for another 6 months until they arrive. So naturally, the impossible task falls on Martin. It's established to be an impossible task when even our hero is forced to ask,
You really expect to hold Cornwallis here using just militia?
Well, not me. You.
Harry, they're not soldiers, they're farmers. They'd be better off letting the British just march through.
by downplaying both his own abilities and that of the militia, and making the enemy out to seem even scarier than they really were, Martin's actions throughout this film are going to seem all the more incredible. But the thing is that it never really translates into the film itself, or at least not very well. Beyond the Battle of Camden, we never see the British as that juggernaut. Martin and his militia are shown to be nearly unstoppable. We have this montage of battle after battle, scene after scene, showing the British and Lord Cornwallis being made out as fools, until at last there is an engagement during which the dragoons ambush them, but even there, that ambush only serves to translate into further embarrassment for Cornwallis personally later on. Indeed, it's after a series of these extraordinary victories of the militia that we have this scene here, after they've captured the personal baggage of Cornwallis and found some of his writings. You remember the ones guarded by the dogs.
I've just been in the mind of a genius. Lord Cornwallis knows more about warfare than we could hope to learn in a dozen lifetimes. His victories at Camden and Charlestown were perfect. Perfect. And he knows it, what's more. And perhaps that's his weakness.
Sir?
Pride. Pride's a weakness.
Again, look at the pattern we see here. We are told, rather than shown, that the enemy is unstoppable. Cornwallis's years of experience and professionalism are marked and subsequently torn down by that common sense of Martin, who exposes a puerile weakness, quote-unquote, in his enemy.
Pride's a weakness.
Immediately after, we get a scene of those hoity-toity British who are too stupid to even realize that an exploding ship isn't part of the evening's entertainment.
Oh, fireworks, lovely.
This revelation of pride as a weakness is anything but. All of his lackeys are sitting around dumbfounded as Martin pontificates, bestowing upon them his perfect military knowledge that his enemy, despite apparently being capable of winning perfect victories, is in fact too proud. Something which evidently has never even crossed anyone else's mind besides Martin's. And it's not just with the militia that we see this play out. Later on, before the film's final battle, even General Greene and his staff are made to sit by and listen as the master tactician espouses his genius plan to defeat the undefeatable enemy, using his pride against him.
I believe you underestimate our militia. All of you do.
We've seen our militia lines break time and again. Kips Bay, Princeton.
But the British have seen that too. Cornwallis's own letters bear out that he has no respect for the militia, none whatsoever.
What are you suggesting, Ben?
I'm suggesting we use that.
You see, those silly experts with their fancy learning don't appreciate the true value of the gritty old citizen militia. But thankfully, once again, good old Ben Martin is there to save the day with his startling revelation that Cornwallis is proud. Now, yes, pride is certainly a deadly sin, but it has little to do with maintaining supply lines, with managing the interior economy of an army or a regiment, with organizing a line of battle or a march, the construction of fortifications or siege works. Rather than being given any solid weakness for Martin to exploit, the film makes this battle out to be a quasi-moralistic one. Martin will win, not because he's the superior soldier, though clearly, of course, he is, but because he's the superior man. He is more moral. He's not clouded in his judgment by things like serving too many years in the army, or even by pride. Remove military details to turn a campaign into a question of morality. Remove any sense of intellect from the other characters to make Martin seem all the more genius for realizing the obvious. Remove any historiography to craft a scenario in which everything Martin says and does turns out to be ultimately correct. Write the script in such a way that any mistake or misdeed on his part is never acknowledged, but things move so quickly that you never even notice how nonsensical it all is. This seems to be the modus operandi of the film. It stretches far beyond just the military methods, but to Martin as a parent, as a citizen, as a soldier, as a man. Even when Martin does things that are ridiculously stupid and make no sense, he is never punished for it. He might even be rewarded for it. Let's look at when his men are being targeted individually by Tavington's dragoons. Having gotten a list of their names, Tavington is moving from home to home, burning them down and murdering the families of the militiamen in an attempt to smoke them out. When the sight of his dead wife and child is too much for this particular war criminal to bear, he shoots himself, prompting Martin, who looks moderately disappointed at the whole affair, to issue this order.
Attend to your families. 1 week furlough for all men. Any man who does not return will not be thought a coward or uncommitted.
Right, so the enemy is moving from home to home, murdering people one by one. Your families and communities are at risk. So what do? Disperse your force back to those families. If the dragoons ride up, what exactly is a single man supposed to do to stop them? If anything, they'll still murder the family, and then either kidnap the man and torture him to give up the others, or just outright kill him. This way, rather than representing a single and unified threat that can try to use this new information of exactly where the dragoons are going and for what purpose, to not only recruit an awful lot more men into their cause, but also to meet the dragoons, ambush them in combat, and try to actually stop it, destroy the organization in one fell swoop. By dispersing his force, he's doing Tavington's work for him. He is neutering his forces and allowing his men to get picked off one by one when they're most vulnerable. It's a stupid decision, but for some reason, Tavington seems to choose this time to just stop the hunt. Takes a little break, I suppose, some R&R before the murdering starts up again. I mean, otherwise, we wouldn't be able to get this great scene when Martin's entire force returns. All at once, for some weird reasons, as if they planned it to specifically be more dramatic. Incidentally, it's in the same scene that we also get this great line from the Frenchman, where the point of the joke seems to be that he wants to kill wounded prisoners of war, which the men have a good laugh about, of course.
Trust the French.
Yes, trust the French. Where else do I get the opportunity to kill a few redcoats? Perhaps a few wounded ones when you're not looking.
When the British do it, it's criminal, but for the rebels, it's just some cheeky old humor with the lads. And also, with his force returning, apparently not having been harassed in any meaningful way whatsoever, the situation, it still hasn't changed at all. The dragoons are still at large. His men's families are still at risk. Again, nothing has changed. Heck, after the wedding scene at the Maroon settlement, Gabriel's new family actually returns home. They leave the safety, nonsensical as that safety was, of their hiding spot, go back to their homes to a town known by Tavington to harbor rebels, and even worse, Martin had to have known that Tavington would know, yet still under no guard, without seemingly even a warning to, keep an eye out for those Green Dragoons. They're kind of murdering a bunch of women and children, incidentally. He just lets them ride on back home as if nothing were wrong. Martin already knew that Tavington was murdering civilians. He did nothing to even attempt or even consider, at least not that we see, attempting to stop this. Now, thankfully for the narrative, at least on this one occasion, Martin's ineptitude is, in fact, punished. Though, of course, within the narrative, it's never actually acknowledged as that, as a mistake on Martin's part. Again, we cannot possibly have any sort of negative PR surrounding our hero. Indeed, we even get to see the entire town refuse to give up the rebel and spare their lives for it, or at least, well, what they would think would be sparing their lives. Obviously, it was a lie all along, but you get the idea. They all just come together for Benjamin Martin, their hero. Except, of course, for one man who, in trying to save the lives of not only himself but his neighbors, immediately becomes the face of cowardice and treason to the village because, again, he dared to go against Martin. But we'll talk about all of that, the exact dynamic, and whether that guy was a good man or a coward or all that jazz. We'll talk about that in its own video, not to worry. Again, even when something bad happens, it really only ever serves to bolster Martin's reputation in the long run, and here that is done by showing just how loved he was and how loyal the community stood by him. Isn't Martin great? Isn't Tavington, and by extension the British, ridiculously evil, over the top evil? Now that theme of even when Martin is punished, he's still rewarded, is something that I touched on earlier when I said that even the part where Martin's force is ambushed, which in the narrative shows a weakness as in his abilities as a tactician, it still ends up leading to a later, more iconic and notable incident in which Martin proves his ultimate superiority over Lord Cornwallis. That being their meeting. You see, the Crown forces took many of Martin's men prisoner after that ambush, and they were going to be...
They're gonna be hung one at a time until they give up the rest of us.
So clearly, something needed to be done. Now Martin concocts his plan, rides out under a flag of truce, and meets with the general who, until this moment, was praised throughout the film as a military genius. Remember, a man capable of perfect victories, with more experience and knowledge
than we could hope to learn in a dozen lifetimes.
And finally now we get to see how the mastermind deals man to man against our hero. Well, first off, Cornwallis is alerted to Martin's arrival in curious fashion. He's leaning back in his chair, luxuriantly reading his book, while two servants are shaving him as if he were the king himself. Far too busy, you see, to attend to mere military concerns.
There is a rider at the gates. A civilian, carrying a white flag.
I'm occupied.
Oh, but then it is revealed that he has the dogs with him. Now Cornwallis is interested. So Dr. Niles Crane, General O'Hara has Martin wait in a separate room for Cornwallis to arrive. A standard procedure and social tactic when negotiating, nothing new there. During that waiting period, though, we get another very rare instance of Martin being somewhat inferior to, well, really anything. Here, in the form of seeing a finely crafted rocking chair in the corner of the room, a little homage to the start of the film and Martin's failures at carpentry and anger management. But any semblance of inferiority is soon lost when Cornwallis enters the room and calls for his dogs.
Jupiter, Mars, come boys, come. Come.
Excellent names for dogs, by the way, but they don't listen to their master. It's only when Martin waves them on that they approach him nervously. And that, on the part of the writers, is, honestly, it strikes me as just dirty storytelling. The representational value of the dogs in this sequence is just so telling. There's a particular, rather crude word that pops into my mind with interaction, but I don't want to go there. Suffice to say, large and powerful dogs, pack animals being subservient to a master, is a very clear and powerful indicator of traditional masculinity. A dog is a man's best friend, is what they say, right? Inseparable, loyal to the end, unquestioningly so. Here, Martin has taken that symbol of masculinity from Cornwallis. By looking to Martin for approval before going to Cornwallis, who is eagerly trying to get their attention, desperately trying, they're showing who the new leader of the pack is. Martin, by stealing this symbol of masculinity, has become the new alpha in this relationship. Do you see what I mean here? Any particular words popping in your head? Oh, who am I kidding? It goes back to classical literature. I can say it here. Cornwallis is being cuckolded by Martin, metaphorically at least. In any case, the meeting commences.
Would you, as the initiating officer, care to begin?
I will, unless, of course, you'd like to claim aggrieved status.
Well, 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 look at that. And is anyone even surprised? While earlier we saw Martin as a rugged, down-to-earth man, unaccustomed to, perchance even faintly uncomfortable in a genteel environment, well, thankfully now the other side of Martin, a statesman, principled, philosophical gentleman, comes out for the meeting. He is able to meet Cornwallis as an intellectual here, proving himself familiar with the ways of military courtesy. Cornwallis offers him the first word, which not only implies he has the power and authority to grant it, but also would put him in the dominant social position. He's forcing Martin to approach him with complaints before offering a reply, rather than the other way around. Ah, but of course Martin is even wittier, and he reverses that role onto Cornwallis, forcing the general to instead come to him with the complaint, despite the fact that Martin was the man to instigate this meeting and is of a lower rank. In an expert move, he has established himself in the position of power, as Cornwallis must come to him. He even goes so far as to, not merely through implications, but spoken directly, grant Cornwallis permission to speak.
Yes, I would like to claim aggrieved status.
Very well, sir. Proceed.
Naturally, upon being granted this permission, Cornwallis explains that Martin has captured many of his personal effects, and he wishes them returned. Certainly it is significant here that these are intimate items, the lack of which has had significant impact on Cornwallis's personal life. We see that much when he's forced to wear
a horse blanket
during a lavish party. These personal, intimate items are a matter of pride, a part of Cornwallis's prestige and reputation. Now, thankfully, Martin immediately agrees to return Cornwallis's pride upon being asked, to which the relief and somewhat disbelief are clear on Cornwallis's face.
Personal effects of a non-military nature, which I'd like to have returned to me.
Indeed. I will do so as soon as possible.
Thank you.
Taking possession of another man's pride and bestowing it back upon being begged markets Cornwallis again made the cuckold. Cornwallis proceeds, again very weakly, with his face inclined downwards and occasionally looking away. Very, very poor body language indeed. His next complaint is against Martin's targeting of officers during military engagements. Cornwallis claims that it is a mark of civilized warfare that officers not be
accorded inappropriate levels of hostile attention.
To your mind, what are appropriate levels of hostile attention?
Again, a comment implying the superiority of Martin's common sense and military practicality, as well as his rugged sense of equality between gentlemen and peasants, in a very modern sense. Officers are fighting the war just as their men are. Should they not be fired upon? Cornwallis's answer, which is a bit of a caricature, but not entirely unrealistic or out of place for the time period, also conveniently opens himself up to once again being trounced by Martin, this time not only through superiority of wit, but also through superiority of morality.
There must be gentlemen in command to lead and where necessary, restrain their men.
Cornwallis explains that an army without officers becomes a disordered and undisciplined mob. Officers exist to restrain their men from immoralities. His simplistic argument also implies a relationship more relying on force and on the threat of punishment than on paternalism and leadership by example, but again, that's something that we'll talk about in future content about Cornwallis and the officer corps overall in future videos. But it does paint a rather nasty portrayal of the British Army, only supporting what we've seen in the film so far. It's not the best argument, and given what Cornwallis knows about his men and their immense immoralities, within, again, the context of the film, it is an outright stupid point for him to bring it up. But somehow, Cornwallis still was unable to see the obvious parry coming his way, and so Martin replies,
Restrain them from, say, targeting civilians, women, children, and such.
That's a separate issue.
In what way is that a separate issue? What kind of a stupid, asinine reply is that? This conversation was basically just, don't kill our officers. If they aren't there, how else could we possibly prevent our soldiers from looting and killing people? That there's no other way we can do it. But you're already looting and killing people. Well, that's besides the point. It's like something out of a sitcom about war crimes. It doesn't just paint Cornwallis out like some stuffy, aristocratic, distant noble who doesn't care at all about the lives of the peasantry, again, problem to discuss another day, but it also portrays him as being outright stupid. It was literally the exact, specific issue he was talking about just a few seconds prior, and now he's backtracking on it like a coward? All the better for Martin to push in for the kill and show the general and the audience how much of a better man he really is.
That's a separate issue.
No. I consider them linked. And as long as your soldiers attack civilians, I will order the shooting of officers at the outset of every engagement. And my men are excellent marksmen.
Very well.
That one's not so much a cuckolding, it's more of Martin just outright grinding Cornwallis into the dust like the petty, selfish little worm he's portrayed to be in this scene. And then Ho, 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 yes, then we come to the really good bit. Interrupting Cornwallis, Martin brings the next item to the table.
Now, let us move on to...
Prisoner exchange.
Sir?
You have 18 of my men. I want them back.
Now put back, Cornwallis confers with General O'Hara, before feigning ignorance in rather silly fashion, refusing to acknowledge the prisoners as Martin's men. Now credit to the writers, even if it is intended more as a comedic relief than anything else, we do get at least a minor semblance of weakness from Martin before the veritable pounding continues, with him leaning in to overhear their conversations in a rather less than dignified fashion. Of course, Martin still holds all the cards, I suppose, and at Cornwallis's refusal to negotiate on the issue of prisoners, he plays the outright worst hand of all time and still manages to win.
But I do have 18 criminals under sentence of death, but I hold no prisoners of war.
If that's your position, 18 of your officers will have to die. 19 if you hang me with my men.
My officers?
Naturally, Cornwallis is confused and surprised. 19 captured officers? Martin has 19 commission-holding prisoners? And he, the general, was unaware of this? We get a blurry image of a small grouping of figures with red coats. If Cornwallis had kept the glass on them, he'd see literally none of them are moving, and he, being a military genius, according to Martin's earlier words, would probably be able to recognize that they aren't actually even real people. I suppose his eyesight is failing him, though, and he asks after their names and ranks.
They refuse to give me their names, but their ranks are 9 lieutenants, 5 captains, 3 majors, and 1 very fat colonel who called me a cheeky fellow.
Now, this is all already pretty suspicious, and their refusal to give names ought to make it even more so in the mind of any military leader, let alone Cornwallis himself. Then we get their supposed ranks. 9 captured lieutenants being unknown to the general is unlikely, I think, but possible. They are, after all, the second lowest rank of commissioned officers and wouldn't even be commanding a full company, at least on paper. However, they are still gentlemen, and in the Revolutionary War, it wasn't unknown for them to actually lead forces in battle beyond their usual scope, given extreme shortages in the officer corps, particularly should these officers be of Cornwallis's own regiment, the 33rd, of whom he was the colonel. As a colonel, he would most assuredly be aware of the loss of any officers within that regiment, again, particularly given the shortages. Of course, those aren't all. 5 captains. Captains are officers of good standing. They are officers of influence and power within a regiment. They usually command full companies of men, or more, again, given the extreme shortages of officers that Cornwallis was facing in the Southern Campaign. You might even see a captain commanding a whole battalion. 5 captains missing is a really big deal. 3 majors, as in the men who are third in command of an entire regiment, the sorts of men who might expect to command a full battalion in the field of battle regularly and dine with General Cornwallis himself. Men who would have a personal relationship with the general had they any sense of career advancement whatsoever, and whose being captured would be worthy of publishing in the papers back in London, let alone being made aware to their commanding officer. And the real icing on the cake? A full colonel. The ceremonial commander of an entire regiment, the kind of officer who might be in charge of multiple battalions in a field of battle. Generally men who are immensely wealthy, men of extraordinary status, men who in this case would personally know Lord Cornwallis. Indeed, Cornwallis himself is a colonel alongside a general. He's a colonel in the 33rd Regiment of Foot. Sir Henry Clinton held a colonelcy of the 7th Light Dragoons. Sir William Howe held a colonelcy of the 23rd Regiment of Foot. A colonel is a very important man. If Cornwallis's army had lost a full colonel captured to the enemy, Cornwallis himself would be fully and painfully aware of that fact. He would immediately know who it was when he was captured, and it would immediately become very important to secure his release. Of course, there are no prisoners. They're just dummies made up of straw to trick Cornwallis. This scenario might be even a teensy tiny bit kinda sorta feasible if they had just stuck with it being 9 lieutenants captured. But dear Lord, did the writers jump the shark with this one. As is, it is utterly and totally ridiculous and makes zero sense for any general of this war to be so utterly and wholly incompetent, let alone a man like Cornwallis. Heck, even Cornwallis, as he's portrayed in the film, should be infinitely more intelligent than this. A more realistic take on Martin's plan here would be that after he says he has even just the lieutenants, let alone the other ranks, Cornwallis would turn to O'Hara, immediately confirm that, no, indeed, there are no officers missing from the books, certainly not in those numbers and strength. The ruse would be discovered, the plot foiled, and Martin thrown out, potentially being laughed at for being so ridiculously overconfident, surpassing outright stupidity. Alternatively, though, let's give the film a little more credit. Let's say that the officers mentioned were more reasonable. Let's say that Martin threatens he's captured 2 or 3 ensigns from good families and a lieutenant. Then, as Cornwallis says,
arrange the exchange.
An exchange. Not let the prisoners walk out the front gate while assuming they let your officers go in good faith. As in, you call the regiments to parade, you confirm, indeed, that your officers have somehow magically gone missing with nobody realizing it, and then you put together a guard of sorts. You march your prisoners out under that guard, out to some neutral and predetermined location, where you meet the rebel militia who have your officers. You confirm once again that there's no funny business, that indeed the rebels do have your officers as they said they did, and that those officers are unharmed and not mutilated in any way. Now, maybe the argument would go that, oh, well, these are gentlemen, they don't have to engage in such levels of extreme precaution and not trusting the other side, but like Cornwallis himself in the film says,
You know, this is not the conduct of a gentleman.
If the conduct of your officers is the measure of a gentleman, I'll take that as a compliment. Get my men.
He's dealing with a man who makes it his business to kill officers. Maybe don't put your absolute trust in him. So again, what we see here is the establishment of an utterly ridiculous, nonsensical, illogical, and totally ahistorical interaction that is designed explicitly from the beginning to make Cornwallis out to be a fool and promote Martin as unbridled perfection. Not only in terms of his military brilliance, but also in terms of his morality, his masculinity, his social class, his wit and manners, and just about everything else you can imagine. The film repeatedly is setting up antagonists made of straw just to let Benjamin Martin smack them down. Even when Martin fails in some capacity, or even when he's punished, it only ever serves to grant him ever greater glory. He never has to grow, never has to develop, he just wins. Even when Martin is leaving the fort with his men, he happens to be met with the arch nemesis himself, Tavington. Now, Tavington, realizing that he can't kill Martin himself without being first attacked, because Martin came in under a flag of truce, of course, Tavington tries to provoke him.
You! Are you the ghost, are you? I remember you. And that farm, that stupid little boy. Did he die? You know, it's an ugly business, doing one's duty. But just occasionally, it's a real pleasure.
But thankfully, as we stare into Martin's cold, dead eyes, we see no real emotion, no reaction, merely a calm yet terrifying reply that Martin will be sure to kill the man, just at a later point when it's more appropriate.
Before this war's over, I'm going to kill you.
Remember those anger issues? I suppose he's gotten over them. Earlier, he couldn't even handle being a poor carpenter, but staring the man who murdered his son in the face, he's able to keep a remarkably clear disposition. You don't see any sign at all of what must presumably be a tumultuous, emotional moment for him, sending him right back to the moment of extreme trauma, holding his dying son in his arms. No, 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 no. He just stands there in perfect, chilling peace, a total and complete check on his emotions. After all, if he let his rage get the better of him, Martin might do something that puts his men and the other son in a position of danger. That's certainly something he would never do.
What did I tell you fellas about shooting?
No, certainly not. So Martin rides off, this time leaving Tavington as sniveling alone. As he does so, as if the message wasn't quite gotten across clearly enough, the film sees fit to really drive home the idea. Martin whistles, and from within the estate, all the doors of which are conveniently still flung open, Cornwallis's two dogs snap up to attention and charge after their new alpha. Cornwallis merely looks on in disbelief. He doesn't shout after them, doesn't call anyone to close the doors, just glances out the window in inaction. None of his batmen catch the dogs, none of the soldiers, and oh, how terribly convenient! They both slip out just in time as the doors to the palisades are shutting. Why, you may ask, were the soldiers closing that door so painfully slowly? Well, for the dramatic effect, of course! Oh, and of course, as run out with their new master, incidentally breaching the terms of the agreement to which Cornwallis's personal property would all be returned to him, what is the song that plays? Well, adding insult to injury, it's none other than the British Grenadiers, a song praising the strength and courage of British arms, here mocking the portrayed simpletons for their insecurities, their arrogance, pride, and utter lack of intelligence. So mark it as one last count of Cornwallis and the entirety of the British Army getting once again cuckolded by the sheer masculine perfection that is good old Benjamin Martin. Oh, but of course, what else would you expect? What more could there be than outright perfection from a man of near godlike qualities? After all, we mustn't forget how this entire sequence began, with a wonderful and quite direct comparison of Benjamin Martin to God, because the film was just too subtle up to this point.
Protect us in this our hour of need. This we ask in the name of the Father, the Son,
Holy Ghost.
Aha! Get it? Because they call him the Ghost, and the priest was in the middle of prayer. So the war criminal, he stands up in the middle of it to interrupt that prayer, and rather than, begging absolution for his sins, instead makes that prayer into a pun that's comparing the mortal man to the triune God, which I suppose the war criminal nominally at least believes in. Not only is such a thing kinda weirdly inappropriate for any actual Christian, at least from my outside perspective, I don't see genuine believers making comparisons that kind of way, but it also serves a much deeper purpose within the film's overall narration. You see, religion serves a very particular function in this film, and it's not the one that Christianity usually preaches. Now, I think that the subject of religion in the film could well be a video all its own, and indeed it will be, but a lot of the nominally Christian themes of the film do specifically relate to Benjamin Martin, and so they're worthy of at least brushing up on in this video as well. Remember that semi-religious opening? As we've said, the themes of sin, retribution, and that assumed pleading for forgiveness are common throughout this entire film. Benjamin Martin has a dark past, and in living his modern life with values of family, equality, and peace, he is seeking to escape that past. The film has, as we shall see in future content, a strong theme of divine retribution, and the sins of war are soon brought back into Martin's life. Well, really, he invited them, but we've already discussed that. Martin finds that he is perhaps less changed than he initially thought. When he again feels the emotional and the physical surging of battle, he again resorts to brutality, to his old self. And when he again meets the harsh reality of warfare, he again turns to murderous and cruel manners of carrying it out. Benjamin Martin, in peace, has never truly escaped the war. He returned to a life of sin as soon as the physical conditions which first led him down that road made themselves again apparent. Not only do these clear signs of trauma from his previous experiences make it all the more ridiculous when he changes his ways at the drop of a hat on the asking of his son, but from the moment that he breaks the covenant of his new life and returns again to war, he begins what you might call another redemption arc. he will once again need to learn how to live a peaceable Christian life just as he did before, if imperfectly. He, if anything, has to learn it even better this time because it clearly didn't really work the last time. The film is filled to the brim with Christian symbolism, often in the form of Martin silently praying at a dramatically lit lone crucifix in the center stage. That is, until the end of the film, after his son, his other son, is killed by Tavington in a most uncomfortable, admittedly, scene. That discomfort aside, it actually does lead to one of, if not the single most beautiful scene in the entire film, when the dying man is found by his father. Finally, it seems like we're getting something that's actually going to force its way through to Benjamin Martin's character, to his very soul. A loss, indeed a punishment for past sins that has at last broken the man down back to his very core. And again, credit where it's due. Mel Gibson's acting, for whatever it may have been in the rest of the film, in this moment it is breathtaking. We really do feel that breaking down, as again, Martin's entire world devolves and collapses to perhaps an even greater extent than it ever did before with the farm burning scene.
I'm sorry about Thomas.
Oh, son, that wasn't your fault. That was mine.
Everything we've seen, everything that Martin has done so far was to prevent this exact thing from happening. And now at the end, it wasn't enough. He wasn't even there to protect his own son. All of this has been for nothing. And in that complete lack of control, that most humbling of all experiences, the realization that his attempting to save his son from death was in vain, as all humans struggling against the inevitable end is, we finally hear the words. See here Benjamin Martin, perfect in wit, perfect in ability, perfect in morality, offer a Kyrie. He begs God for help. Finally, he and the film both actually acknowledge his weaknesses and limitations more than just nominal script writing. We see and we experience alongside Martin that he is not, in fact, perfect. That some things no man, not even he, can control. And in the next scene, when we see Martin sitting at the side of his son's corpse, we finally hear the film admit that. And we have what would seem to be a final, and rapidly reached, conclusion to Martin's redemption arc. It's when Colonel Burwell comes in to ask the grieving father if he would continue the fight, saying it's what his son would have wanted.
Benjamin, nothing will replace your sons. But if you come with us, you can justify their sacrifice.
After which Martin's part in the next conversation, while I don't really agree with it myself, from a Christian moral context, it is beautiful, absolutely beautiful and enlightened.
Why do men feel they can justify death? Is it arrogance? I have long feared that my sins would return to visit me. And the cost is more than I can bear.
There we have the full context for those first words of the film. Finally, through it all, we have the payoff of all that crucifix symbolism. Martin, who seemed perfect in every way, has suffered the final and greatest punishment of all, the only one that truly matters. And finally, through that ultimate suffering, his own passion, he might know true righteousness. So Burwell continues on, attempting to coax Martin back into worldly matters with news regarding the war, to which Martin, again most expertly the theologians might agree, replies,
Victory in the war is within our grasp.
Go then. Seek your victory. I'm small issue to it.
You're wrong, Benjamin. You matter to your men and to others as well. Stay with us. Stay the course.
I have run my course.
And after those fateful words that Martin has run his course, he turns back in prayer to the body of his son, his new crucifix, the cross which he alone must now bear. At last, he has returned back to the realization that his character had at the start of the film, that carrying on with the war would only bring suffering and pain, that it would not save anyone. And it would seem that he has finally remembered those much remarked upon words. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the peacemakers, and blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. Again, I'm not necessarily saying that I agree with these sentiments in this particular context. I'm not a pacifist, and I am not a Christian. However, within the Christian context, and indeed this film throughout has seemed extremely fit to utilize and promote that Christian context, this is the correct answer. If this were a Christian film, and indeed if it stuck with the theme of redemption through faith, this would be the end of the film. This is the end of Martin's character arc. He has come to know the true meaning of the words of the Lord his God, and that, like Israel of old, attempting to fight against fate has proven futile. That all he has is the fear of the Lord, and that through the love of the Lord alone might he be saved. From the beginning he sought vengeance for his son, and it brought him only destruction. Now he realizes that vengeance will not save him. Blessed are those who mourn. But, wait a second, what is this? A flag? For a cause that you have no real direct association with? Repaired by your son? Well, gee golly, if that doesn't just change literally everything! Screw the religious symbolism, screw the actual theology, screw literally every other sign in this entire God-forsaken, and I can say that meaningfully now, film. Instead, he goes with Burwell's argument. Blessed be the people who seek revenge, and blessed are those who seek to achieve political ends through means of violence. He takes up the flag, rides out to the army, and we get this all-American scene of good old Ben Martin once again going out to save the day. Now, look, there is a logic to the idea that the final reminder of what his son was fighting for and died for was something of a final straw that turned his mind around, seemingly against character. It's a common trope in film, and it isn't inappropriate here. However, for a film that repeatedly attempts to show Martin's struggle as a one of his faith, indeed, the faithful might say a struggle for his immortal soul, well, this is a complete change of direction, and really kind of out of the blue at the last second. Now, perhaps it still doesn't seem quite too inappropriate, out of place, out of theme with the overt Christian symbolism of the film, which again, we'll talk about that in greater depth in a future video, because that symbolism does go far beyond Martin's own character alone. But I think what I'm saying here will become much clearer when we get to the final conclusion of the film, and that last battle in which Martin finally kills Tavington and single-handedly saves the rebel cause. As you'd imagine, there's an awful lot we could talk about regarding Martin in this final battle. He's totally incapable as a commander, but thankfully the British are just as bad and make the same stupid mistakes. He's totally impervious in battle against all number of enemy soldiers until, of course, he comes to the more dramatic, story-driven final fight when he can finally be wounded for plot purposes, and literally all of his soldiers just run past and ignore him during that fight for the same reason. Oh, and of course, how could we ever forget that most iconic moment in which Martin's personal cause is, you guessed it, conflated with the overall national cause in most disturbing fashion when Martin literally uses the American flag as a weapon against the evil oppressor. Which is kind of funny, of course, considering that Martin isn't really even fighting for that cause. He's fighting for the memory of his son, but still, he's being used here to represent the entirety of the rebel effort. Again, classic propaganda move: take the people's loyalty to an individual and commitment to their individual struggles, and then translate those emotions into loyalty to the state and its own efforts. But in any case, we'll go into much further depth with all of that in future content, including a specific video on this abomination of a battle scene. For now, let's skip ahead to the conclusion of this, the final duel of good and evil. No, maybe not. The final duel of right and wrong. No, it doesn't work. Of protagonist and antagonist. Yes, that works. Let's go to some of the dialogue right at the end of that fight, shall we? Before delivering what he believes will be a killing blow, Tavington takes his villainous time to gloat over the victory.
Kill me before the war is over, will you? It appears you are not the better man.
Of course, in a manner paralleling how Tavington killed his son, Martin's supposed incapacity is a ruse. He expertly dodges the blow. I suppose he's just able to sense the wind of the approaching blade, like an elf or something, twists around and impales his foe with a bayonet before saying,
"My sons were better men."
Finally, we have closure, wonderfully paired with the rebel battlefield victory, as if the symbolism wasn't obvious enough earlier. So Martin proves superiority of wit and arms yet again, and the war is over. Well, not really. It's actually going to last for quite a while yet, historically, but the rest of the campaigning to the end of Yorktown is covered in less than 2 minutes, literally less than 2 minutes. And in the name of wrapping up the film as quickly as possible, in order to avoid having to possibly dwell long on the military, economic, political, social aftermath of a war, and instead continually bask in the moment of triumphal glory, we get a quick goodbye, a letter to the family, and then the happy return. Again, 2 minutes after the final battle, here Martin is bringing his family back home to the new estate that his men are building for him, free of charge, of course, because they just love him so much, alongside his 2 new dogs, his children, and the new wife. Well, yes, you were expecting that, of course, I'm sure. He developed a romantic interest with his sister-in-law. The kid's aunt is now their new mom, after the first wife died about 8 or 9 years ago. Anyways, we have a happy return, not only to normalcy, but to an implied, bigger and brighter future.
Gabriel said if we won the war, we could build a whole new world. Just figured we'd get started right here, with your home.
Again, textbook conflation of the personal with the national there. Great stuff, gotta love it. There are no indicators whatsoever of any strife or struggle to come. It is the quintessential happy ending. Martin, it seems, has found closure for the death of his 2 sons, because he in turn was able to solve the blood feud by killing the man who killed them. His still living sons, remember, the one who literally feared him and the other who was talking about enjoying killing people, they're fine too, all smiles. The daughters who witnessed their brother shot, a powerful maternal figure in their lives dragged away screaming by soldiers, their home and all earthly possessions burnt down, their father running off into the woods before coming back covered in blood, all in the past. Everything's fine now, and they have 2 new dogs, even a new mommy. Turns out mental illness is still super easy to deal with. In Martin's case, dealing with not only the terrible knowledge of what you did in the war, but on top of that, the tragedy of having not 1 but 2 sons die in your arms, to say nothing of the realization that his daughter-in-law and many good friends were literally burnt alive. It's all a very simple equation. Stab the man who did it all in the throat, and the PTSD just disappears. The conclusion conclusion of this film, again so heavily reliant on themes of forgiveness, of divine retribution, and with so much crucifix symbolism, is a one that shows that revenge works. Martin was wronged by a man, and he exacts his revenge. That is what brings him peace. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the peacemakers. The entire character arc of Martin seeking peace and forgiveness of his sins is totally and completely thrown by the wayside in favor of a narrative of military triumph and bloody revenge. Again, I'm not trying to make an objective moral statement here, but within the context of the film, this is not a Christian message or a Christian ending whatsoever. It is the exact opposite. Like I said earlier, if the film had an actual theological message, Martin's arc would have ended when he rejected worldly concerns and instead turned to God for forgiveness, placing his faith and fear in the Lord rather than the American rebel cause. Martin never gets his revenge because he begins to understand that revenge would not bring back his sons, and he retreats from the war. If you wanted to continue a Christian, a traditionally biblical ending, you could continue the ending to show Tavington after the war. Having survived, but on the losing side, he is, as was alluded to earlier in the film, forced to return to England where his brutal methods were not welcomed by polite society. And he is ostracized by his peers. For Tavington, it was already heavily implied throughout the film that a fate far worse than death in the battlefield as a soldier would be to die destitute, penniless, alone, reviled by his former peers. A man who pursued a life of greed and anger and pride and jealousy, reaping the rewards of his sin. Alternatively, maybe you really wanted to have that final fight. You didn't want to just see Tavington die of old age in a ditch somewhere, abandoned and unloved. You wanted to see him really get it in a battle. And maybe you still really wanted to kill him off while simultaneously showing how much of a better man Martin really is. Again, that would be thematic enough for the rest of the film. Well, okay, the classic trope is already written for you. Martin gets the better of him and disarms the villain. Martin's got the bayonet to his throat, just one thrust away from bloody revenge, and then, just before the final moment, we have a zoom in of Martin's fiery eyes. They go dark. His scowl disappears. He whispers to himself,
"My sons were better men."
And he throws the bayonet aside. He turns around and begins to stride away. We have a shot over Martin's shoulder to see Tavington raggedly coming to his feet. Better men were they, he growls to himself. Taking up a blade, he begins to run for Martin, a blood-curdling scream as he does. A single shot rings out over the din. Tavington falls. Behind him, the Frenchman with a smoking musket. Or Burwell, or say any of the militiamen, or Continental, anyone, for God's sake, my lord, what a better ending that would have been! How much more appropriate, how much more dramatic, how much more meaningful and impactful for the overall message of the film up until the end, for Martin to have that realization that revenge will not solve his problems. How much more meaningful and consistent with his pleading for forgiveness, for understanding why it is that men can do such things, and all of that jazz, all of the hinting, all the symbolism would make sense at that point. But no, we just get revenge. He kills the guy and then it's a happy ending. It's simplistic is what it is. Now, before anyone goes giving me credit for literally any of that, I totally ripped it from the Hornblower series. I recommend that you go watch that. It's a palate cleanser after all of this trash. But point being, I think that this ending, as it's actually in the film, is lazy. They took the easy way out. Good guy kills bad guy, good guy happily ever after. Game, set, match. It's uninspired is what it is. And because that revenge was all that Martin needed to do, and now he gets his happy ending with his wife and the kids and the dogs and presumably a white picket fence at some point in time, it means that he as a character really, again, didn't have to grow in any real way. Throughout the entire movie, in what ways did Benjamin Martin develop? Did he come to love the American cause? Surprisingly, no, actually, he didn't. Did he become a better father? No, the kid's problems all went away for no reason. The daughter reached out to him. Did he become stronger in his faith? Nope, turns out Jesus was wrong. Revenge is the way to go. Did he become a better man in any way? I mean, he stopped war criming, I guess, because his son asked nicely, but that's about it. Did the war change Martin in any meaningful way? Well, he never really came to terms with what he did in the last war. He told the story to his son, but that's about it. We never saw any closure there. He isn't leaving with any physical scarring. He's pretty much unscathed by the entire thing. Again, the only guy who was able to even touch him was Tavington for that final climactic battle, as if it was meant to be dramatic, as if we didn't know exactly what was going to happen the entire time. Mentally, he seems to be doing pretty well too, despite it all. We actually see him smiling at the very end in a much more genuine way than ever before. Again, I guess a healthy dose of revenge does wonders for the psyche. I mean, maybe his anger issues might be gone, maybe he worked through that, but really that's a 50-50. We don't really see anything of Martin after the war. Maybe he even gets worse. I mean, it'd make sense, repressing all of those issues he has without actually resolving anything. I mean, in a realistic setting, those kids are probably not going to have a very good time either. The new wife really married into a pretty mentally disturbed family, given all the stuff that they collectively went through. It seems to me that, at the end of it all, the Benjamin Martin that we see after nearly 3 hours of this film is effectively the same Benjamin Martin that we saw at the start. But to be fair, I mean, what development could there really be? You can't have a learning curve to soldiering and fighting when your protagonist is already an expert who's able to kill an entire platoon, an entire company in the first action of the film. You can't really have any soul-searching when the other characters go out of their way to accommodate the man that he already is, flaws and all. You can't have any stimulating challenges for them when they repeatedly outsmart and outmaneuver the supposedly superior antagonists. Even Martin's defeats, limited as they were, never taught him a lesson. They never changed him. They only ever served to either better demonstrate how good he was in the long run, or to arbitrarily further his storyline. And even when Martin is shown as not being an absolute moral good, when the baddies of your film are shown to be doing things just as bad and way worse even, and doing so over and over again, well, from an emotional perspective to the audience, it's going to invalidate any stories you tell of something bad that Martin did years and years ago. Particularly when you associate that character so strongly with something as vague as the American cause. At the beginning of this video, I asked whether Benjamin Martin was a good or a bad character. And while Mel Gibson may have some excellent moments in this film from an acting perspective, and while Martin may have had some good parts to him too, really, overall, I think the answer is pretty clear-cut and obvious. Benjamin Martin is a bad character. He's poorly thought out, poorly written, and experiences no character development. He is propped up to be the classic protagonist, the all-American hero, the humble, average guy with a troubled past and struggling with the things he's done, who after experiencing tragedy is forced to navigate a difficult position with moral quandaries until in the end, against all odds, he comes out on top. That's what the movie, it seems, wants him to be. That's how it wants the audience to look at him, and it's how it wants them to relate to him. The film fails in all of those regards, and it does so tragically. Benjamin Martin is a shadow of a character, and I dare to say he is, unfortunately, an insult to the very men whom this film initially sought to glorify. Thank you all so very much for watching. Of course, special thanks are owed to this video's sponsor, the YouTube channel Boney Wright. Again, you can find a link to their channel in the description down below, and all sorts of different content which they have on offer. And then, of course, as well, to my ever-beneficent supporting classes on Patreon.com, for it is by virtue of their support that I am able to carry on making videos just like this one, no matter how long they take to make. And of course, to you as well, my dear viewer. For until the next time, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.